Do you get Newsweek magazine at your house, or I know nowadays I need to say, or do you look at it online? Well, Newsweek still comes in paper form to our house. We're that age, you know. And I was kind of surprised this week when I saw an article in here, a very short article that's entitled A Graham Slam. This is how it starts. Anne Graham Lotz, the second of Billy and Ruth Graham's 5 children, says it's all right as long as you have a personal relationship with Jesus. Church doesn't really matter. Neither does denomination. Religion is an impediment to knowing God, she says. The article goes on to say that, like so many other Christians, Ms. Lotz, who's 61, they always have to give people's ages, had too many bad experiences in church to believe that God dwells there, and only there. She was kicked out of one church, it says, for a disagreement about something. She left another more recently in a fight concerning a pastor. She soon came to realize that she was a believer in exile. Well, certainly we have heard that many times, those of us who are involved in churches. We will even have church members say to us, I can worship God just as well out in nature or on the golf course as I can in a sanctuary. Well, I'm not a golfer, but I have heard that God's name is sometimes used on the golf course, although probably not in exactly the same way that we use God's name when we're in a sanctuary worshiping God on a Sunday morning or some other time. Now, if we talk about this with church members, why is it important that Christians become part of a worshiping community, a studying community, a mission-minded community? We will say that we can do all of those things much better when we're together. We'll say that it's much better to do Bible study with other people. It's much easier to do mission work if we're gathered together in a church and make decisions about how we're going to reach out to people who need our help. It's much easier for us to have Christian education for our own children if it's in a setting outside of our own house, where they can be with other children or young people and learn about who Jesus is, and through Jesus, who God is in our lives. If we come right down to it, though, the one thing that we really can do in a church setting, no matter what size the church is, better than anybody can do anywhere else, is worship God together in this kind of a setting. Really, it's only in churches, when we gather together, that we can do that. And sometimes when we talk about why we need to be together as Christians, we'll say to one another that it is so that we can correct each other, so that if we begin to stray a little bit in the way we interpret Scripture, or if we begin to drift a little bit in our spiritual lives, we can call each other back together and call each other together to have a discussion about the direction that our lives ought to be taken. Now, in the 19th century and in the early 20th century in the Presbyterian Church, there was a very formal way of doing this. In other words, if someone was missing worship for some reason, there was a very formal way of calling them back together. It was called churching them. I have served a church in this presbytery in whose records there are several accounts of people being churched. For instance, one of the members of the church, even though he was in worship himself on Sundays, was reprimanded, was churched, because he shipped cattle on a Saturday, and they would still be traveling on the railroad on Sunday, and so he was thereby causing someone else not to be in their own worship service. There was a woman who was churched, who was reprimanded because she ground coffee on a Sunday, and that was something that you were not supposed to do because it took your thoughts away from God on that Sabbath day. Well, we certainly wouldn't consider any of those ways of encouraging one another to be true to their spiritual lives in the 21st century. But even in the 21st century, when someone isn't in worship on a Sunday morning, we will sometimes mention that to them. Usually the way we say it is, we missed you at church, or we really needed you in choir, you're the whole alto section, or we needed you to be there for Sunday school on Sunday morning. I wonder if we could take a little bit different approach in our way of thinking that being together as Christians is important for each one of us, and we need to encourage one another in our spiritual lives. What if instead of taking that approach, we would say to one another, you know, I was in church on Sunday, and you really missed a sermon that was so meaningful, that really helped me to understand my relationship with God in a new way. Or what if we said to our friends who had missed worship, oh, you should have been there to hear the music on Sunday morning. It was so inspiring. I understood my relationship to God again and was reconfirmed in that, and I imagine that would have happened for you too. Or maybe we could say to one another, you should have been there for the children's message. Those kids were wild on Sunday, but our associate pastor was so calm with them and so welcoming of them that it reminded us all of how God treats each one of us. We need to find ways, maybe not to church one another when we drift away a little bit as part of a church community, but find ways to encourage one another to be in worship, to glorify God and enjoy God forever, because that's the purpose for which we were born. Even Mrs. Lotz, even Billy Graham's daughter in this article in Newsweek, ends up at that place, even though she's had some bad experiences, because where she ends up is where we end up as well. She says, you can really love the Lord, but after a while, if you're all by yourself, the fire goes cold.